Before the Roman Empire paved its first road, before the Colosseum cast its first shadow, before Caesar whispered his first decree, there was fire in Africa. Not the fire of destruction, but the fire of creation. The controlled, deliberate, genius-level fire of iron smelting. And for 1500 years, the people of Nubia fed that fire with a mastery so complete, so dominant, so economically and technologically superior, that entire dynasties were built on its output. This is not mythology. This is not Afrocentric wishful thinking. This is documented metallurgical history that was buried, rewritten, and quietly erased from the global conversation, because if the world knew the truth, the entire narrative of African technological inferiority would collapse like the fraud it has always been. For every black man or woman who has been told that Africa had no industry, no science, no legacy worth studying, this story is your inheritance. This is your bloodline speaking. And the fact that you were never taught it is not an accident. It is a policy. It is a choice made by people who understood that identity is power, and that a people who do not know what they built cannot fully claim what they deserve. Today, we are taking that story back. To understand what Nubia built, you have to understand where Nubia sat, not just on a map, but in the architecture of human civilization. The Kingdom of Kush, which encompassed the land we now call Nubia, stretched across the Nile Valley in what is today northeastern Sudan and southern Egypt. It was not a fringe culture. It was not a satellite of Egypt. It was a sovereign civilization with its own pharaohs, its own script, Meroitic, its own religious traditions, and its own extraordinary economic engine. The city of Meroë, the capital of the Kushite kingdom from roughly 300 BC to 350 CE, was the industrial heart of the ancient African world. And what made Meroë extraordinary was iron. The region around Meroë sat on massive deposits of iron ore. The forest nearby provided the charcoal fuel. The Kushite engineers, whose names history has largely erased, developed sophisticated blast furnace technology that allowed them to smelt iron at scale, at consistency, and at volume that was unmatched anywhere in the ancient world for over 15 centuries. Archaeological excavations at the site have uncovered slag heaps, the leftover waste from iron smelting, so enormous, so mountainous in their accumulation, that early 20th century archaeologists literally nicknamed Meroë the Birmingham of Africa, referencing the industrial powerhouse of 19th century Britain. Think about that. The comparison wasn't to ancient Rome. It wasn't to ancient Greece. The sheer physical evidence of Nubian industrial output was so overwhelming that even colonial-era scholars, men deeply committed to minimizing African achievement, had to reach for the language of industrial revolution to describe what they were looking at. King Nastasen ruled around 335 BC. King Egamines II, around 270 BC, began asserting Meroitic independence in the fullest cultural and economic sense. By the height of Meroitic power, between 100 BC and 200 CE, Meroë was exporting iron tools and weapons across sub-Saharan Africa, into the Arabian Peninsula, and along the Red Sea trade networks that connected Africa to India and the Mediterranean. Roman merchants knew the name. Egyptian traders depended on the product. The Nile was not just a river. It was a shipping lane. And Meroë was the factory at its source. Now here is where the story becomes something more sinister than simple neglect. The erasure of Nubian industrial history was not passive. It was not the natural drift of time washing away inconvenient facts. It was active, deliberate, and carried out by specific institutions with specific motivations. The primary agents of this erasure were European colonial scholars operating in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the same period when European powers were carving up Africa at the Berlin Conference of 1884, when they needed ideological justification for conquest and enslavement. The argument was simple and monstrous: Africa had no history worth respecting. Africa had no technology, no statecraft, no civilization independent of outside influence. Therefore, colonization was not theft. It was, in their framing, a gift. To maintain that lie, certain histories had to disappear. When British and German archaeologists first excavated Meroë in the early 1900s, the iron slag heaps were so massive they could not be explained away. The response was not to revise the narrative. The response was to minimize, to reattribute, and to bury findings in academic journals that the general public would never read. Carl Richard Lepsius, the German Egyptologist whose expeditions through Sudan in the 1840s catalogued enormous amounts of Kushite material culture, framed his findings in ways that consistently positioned Nubian achievement as derivative, influenced by Egypt, influenced by the Mediterranean, never as an independent, originating genius. His work set the template for decades of scholarship that followed. Even the Meroitic script, a fully developed writing system with alphabetic properties that predates many European alphabets, was treated as a curiosity rather than a triumph. It was partially deciphered only in 1909 by Francis Llewellyn Griffith, and even then, the cultural and intellectual implications of a literate, iron-producing African civilization writing its own history in its own language were never amplified to the public. The textbooks of the 20th century that shaped what millions of students in America, Europe, and across the African diaspora learned about the ancient world simply excluded Meroë from the conversation. Egypt was included, but Egypt was often racially ambiguated, stripped of its African context, represented by lighter-skinned figures in Hollywood films and classroom illustrations. Nubia, Dhaka, further south, with no pyramids that could be easily co-opted, was simply left out. And yet it survived. History has a way of hiding things in plain sight. The ironworking traditions that originated or were amplified in Meroë did not die when the city fell. They spread. They migrated south and west through sub-Saharan Africa with the movement of people, the transmission of technique from master to apprentice, from father to son, from elder to community. The Bantu expansion, one of the largest human migrations in African history, spanning roughly 3,000 years and covering the majority of sub-Saharan Africa, carried ironworking knowledge as one of its defining cultural technologies. Linguists and archaeologists have traced the vocabulary of iron smelting across Bantu language families, finding cognate words for furnace, bellows, slag, and iron that demonstrate a common origin point. That origin point traces back, again and again, to the Nile Valley corridor and the Kushite tradition. In West Africa, the Yoruba tradition of Ogun, the deity of iron, war, labor, and technology, preserves in religious form a deep cultural reverence for metalworking that stretches back through oral history thousands of years. Ogun is not a minor figure in the Yoruba spiritual system. He is one of the most powerful orishas, and his domain is precisely the domain that Meroë mastered, the transformation of raw earth into tools that build civilization. That religious memory is a form of historical documentation. It is how a people who were denied literacy by colonizers and slavers kept their technical and cultural inheritance alive in the only form that could not be banned. In Ethiopia, the Beta Israel community, the Ethiopian Jewish community, maintained ironworking traditions so ancient that scholars believe they predate the Common Era. In the Great Lakes region of Central Africa, the Haya people of what is now Tanzania developed a pre-industrial steel-making technique, rediscovered by anthropologist Peter Schmidt in the 1970s, that produced carbon steel of a quality comparable to modern industrial processes, and they did it using forced air furnaces a full 15 centuries before similar technology appeared in Europe. That is not a footnote. That is a revolution in the history of technology. And it survived entirely outside the Western academic tradition, passed down through practice and oral instruction, because the people who carried it refused to let it die. The architecture of Nubia survived too. The pyramids of Meroë, over 200 of them, steep